Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Extraordinary Family Life Podcast. We're your hosts, Greg and Rachel Denning, coming to you from Portugal. And I don't know about you, babe, but I'm loving it here. We've been going to the beach and watching the sunset in the evening, playing in the water and the sand.
It is very nice.
Walking through the woods. It's just our house and then the woods and to the beach, and it is a little bit of heaven. Aaliyah, who's our 16-year-old daughter, she and I found a Krav Maga and like an intentional hit martial arts training. We have been loving that. Still sore. We've been 3 times. I'm still sore, even after a Thai massage that Rachel and I went to get. Like this stuff is good. I love it. I love pushing hard. We're all going to a self-defense martial arts class tonight. Good things going on. Raising our new puppies. You guys, we're living the dream. Living the dream. I bought my dream truck, which many of you would laugh at because it's more like a tractor than a truck. But I love it. Got my dogs, and we
The
just got a
Defender
setup.
180. Is that what
It's a 130.
Oh,
Yep.
I don't
so
even
it's a
know.
Land Rover
130.
Defender. They don't even have them in the States very much. They've got a few old ones, but Land Rover Defender 130 truck. Oh, it's awesome. So we're loving it. All these fun things that we've been thinking about, planning on, strategizing for a long time are now. It's just the timing has worked out. Here we are, making it happen. It's awesome.
Yes.
And so now we're getting more settled in our house. We're leaning back more into a consistent education schedule.
After 6 months of travel.
Which is extremely educational.
Yes.
And our philosophy is you need both. You need a lot of hands-on experiential learning. If you do traveling right, some people go out and travel and they don't learn anything. They're just wandering around and like
They come out of the sea of knowledge without a drop on them.
without getting a drop on them. I don't know how people do
Speaking about
it.
books today and loving books, we're quoting from a family favorite called The Phantom Tollbooth.
Such a great book. Such a great book.
Which is a great book for youth to read. So
it's a great book for you to read.
It is,
adults. There's so many great principles.
I think
in
as
there.
we go through here, we'll mention books.
Yep,
and,
perfect. That'd be great. So yeah, you can go out and travel and not get much out, but if you travel well, you can learn so much, infinitely more than you can actually get from a classroom or a book or a video, whatever. It's experiential learning. But you also need book learning. This is our core philosophy. You have to read the books. Lots and lots and lots of books, hundreds of books, and then thousands of books. I think a sustainable, I know this is going to ruffle some of you, but I think it's sustainable to try to average a book a week for the rest of your life. I think totally possible. Now, the average American reads less than 1 book a year.
Maybe. I've been wondering about checking up on that statistic, but that was something I at least read
It was
decade or two.
Yeah, that was less. So it's probably less now.
Or maybe it's more because
they're
reading
binge watching Netflix.
Well, yeah.
It's insane.
We'll talk about those things.
But okay, we got to read. And yes, we are huge advocates of listening to audiobooks. We'll dive more into that.
Well, yeah, we're going to dive into all of that. So essentially, we received a question, which is why we're doing this topic. We have talked about it before, I know, but we talked about it, I think, in our coaching with what is now called the 28-Day Challenge. But we're going to do it here. We're going to do it on the podcast because this is, a broader audience. So I want to read the question that I received through Instagram. If you're not following us on Instagram, I'm World School Family and Greg is greg.denning. So get on there. It's a great way to connect with us, to ask us questions. Okay. Do you have a podcast episode or advice somewhere where you talk about how you instilled a love of reading in your children? We parents love reading and have read a lot to the children when they were young. Sometimes we still do now, but no matter which book we suggest, they hate reading and it breaks my heart.
Oh, that's good.
That is good.
And Thank you so much for asking the question.
You. So, first of all, a couple things come to mind right away when I read this. Because, she says, how have you instilled a love of reading in your children? Well, I think it's kind of funny because if you ask some of our younger children, they'd probably be like, oh, I hate reading. I don't like reading. Because the definition we have as parents of what reading is and what that means versus the definition a child might have don't always match up, because in our mind, reading might be one thing, it means this, but to the child it means something else. Our kids love to read with us. They love to have us read to them.
Essentially, they love stories.
Yes, which I want to talk about a lot today, the importance of stories. And our 12-year-old loves audiobooks. He listens to them all day long. But if you said, do you love reading? He'd probably be like, no, I don't. Despite the fact that I want to walk through here today, he does actually love it, even though it looks different than what it used to look like, and maybe what we think it should look like as parents. And that's one of the things I want to talk about, because sometimes we need to change our definitions here of what it actually means when we say we want our kids to love learning. Taking into the context of, for one, what does that actually mean? What does it mean? I want my kids to love learning. Well, what does that mean, really? Is it really that we just want our kids to sit down and love to read a book, or is there some sort of benefit or outcome we want from them reading books?
Well, you said, you threw a little word in there, I don't know if you intended to. You said we want our kids to love learning. I think you meant to say we want our kids to love reading, and I'm glad you threw that word in there, because we want them to love learning.
Yes.
And we see that as, that's a little bit what we want. We're like, we want our kids to read because we want them to learn. And so we want them to love learning. And loving learning is actually pretty natural. Most people love learning. They do.
They just wouldn't necessarily define it as learning.
Right, exactly. And they wouldn't necessarily connect reading with learning.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, reading is actually, it's more work. So especially when you're learning how to read, and reading seems like a chore, so you have to have a reward that's commensurate, is that the right word, with the effort. So if it's a lot of effort to read, and I vividly remember this because I struggled with reading so much. I was such a slow reader, and reading was so much work for me. So I loved it. Totally transformed my life when my sister read stories. So she would read her books. So she was a teenager, and she would get these little romantic, emotional books, and she just would read out loud to us as we were little kids. So we'd just sit there and hear stories. And I'm like, oh my gosh. We were like crying together and like laughing and just having this just super emotional experience with these families, right? We'd get to know the characters. We'd fall in love with them. And we'd be like, no, please don't. Or we'd celebrate with them. I got into the emotional story of humanity. I love that. Then my sister moved out. And I remember like, gosh, I want stories. I want more stories. I'm like, I have to read them. And my uncle was like, he just had this idea. He'd read books, and then after that, he would just get rid of them because he's I've read that. I'm never going to use it again. So he didn't keep his library. So he started handing them off to me. And he handed me this Tom Clancy book that was like 1,200 pages. And I just held that thing, and I like looked how many pages there were. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's retarded. Like, no. It's all I saw was work. But my desire for stories finally compelled me to at least start.
Right.
And then I read that whole book and read it fast. I just couldn't get enough of it. It was such a great story. And then, so my love of stories, my love of learning, and I wouldn't call it love of learning. I would have called it love of stories.
Yeah.
My love of stories compelled me finally to push through the hump of work, the effort of work. And the sense of accomplishment I had as a 12-year-old kid to have read a 1,200-page book, was, especially being a slow reader where reading was so difficult for me, I was over the moon.
Right.
And I was like, oh, I can do this. And that's where I fell in love with reading. And then I just read like crazy. Every book I get my hands on, I just read like crazy. And now it was all storybooks.
Yes.
But I loved it. And so I read. Well, then eventually as I mature, and I'm like, dang, I want to figure out how to solve this problem. I moved out on my own. I'm 16. I'm trying to figure out life. And I'm like, oh, I can turn to books. Well, I already had a skill of reading. I already had a love of reading. So now I'm like, I can turn to personal development books and professional development books and books that can make my life better. And then that has turned into, still to this day, average a book a week and have for well over 2 decades. And then audiobooks came along.
Well, right. So I want to get there, but there's a couple things here. One of them, back to this idea of defining what it exactly is, what is the outcome you want by having your children love learning. There's like multiple layers here, and we kind of have to unpack the layers and get down to understanding where we're at and where we want to go, and what layer comes before that. So if we identify, I want my kids to love reading because I want them to love learning, because for us, I know it's about personal development. We know that when we read, us personally, it helps improve our life. It gives us insights. We've learned about marriage and parenting and finances and everything from reading. But for a kid, they don't really care about that as much. They're not interested in personal development per se. They're not interested in nonfiction, right? And so if we think, I want my kids to read for those outcomes, and maybe that's what the outcome you want, maybe it's something different, that's not going to be a motivating force for them. And so we go back to what we've been talking about here is story. Story is actually what drives human beings to be engaged in something, to be engaged in a book, to be engaged in a movie, to be engaged in someone telling a story. It's the story aspect. So if we want our children to learn to love learning, ultimately, they have to learn to fall in love with stories. That's the first step.
And I think it's important there when we're talking to our kids, we're strategically may not use words like reading or learning. We're gonna talk about what they want. You want some stories?
Yeah.
Do you want me to tell you a story or read you a story? You want to check out this cool story? And they're drawn to the story, but you're like, hey, would you want to do some learning? No. Hey, why don't you do your reading? No.
Exactly. Right. So we focus on the aspect that they are drawn to, which is the stories, and we use that to our benefit. And you, in your story about your own life story, you shared important principles there. And the same happened for me too, because I also fell in love with reading because of reading, what nowadays we might call fluffy books, you and I. But those were the stories that got me into the reading. And so it was that love of learning about someone and hearing the story and wanting to get over the hump of having to put in the work that got us to fall in love with the process of reading, which then led to us loving reading. So it's multiple steps here. You can't just say, I want my kids to love reading and try to make them read so that they love it. They won't. They have to fall in love first with stories. And of course that starts by
you being absolutely in love with learning and with stories and with reading.
You're in love with it first, and then you have to read to them, which they mentioned that's something they did. They read to their kids. But then we kind of come to this awkward phase, starting maybe around 11 or 12, where we may not be reading to them as much anymore, and we want them to do more reading, and we have to bridge that gap. Now that gets difficult because they're at an age where they don't want to read just anything. They don't want to just read whatever you suggest. If they want to read at all, which they may not want to do, it's going to be something that they are interested in. And so that's actually what we have to build on. We do have to use that to our advantage, because a lot of parents are like, I can't find anything that my kids are interested in reading. Now, I get how that can seem to be the case, but the reality is there's so much content out there nowadays. I guarantee there's going to be something.
Literally impossible.
It's impossible to not find something. Now, it can be difficult to find something that you might deem appropriate, because there's plenty of things out there that I don't want my kids reading either.
Trash.
So it does take research, it does take looking, it does take asking to find things. But if you can find, or when you can find the books that they are interested in, and nowadays it's cool because they do a lot of series. There's not just one book. It's like series of, it's the thing people have done for a while, but there's a lot of them out there, of series with hours and hours and content. Our children have gone through hundreds of hours in one series, sometimes 40 hours in one book of content And they love it. They can't get enough. Now, that maybe this is a good time to switch to discussing audiobooks.
Well, first I want to back up, because we might be tempted to kind of check the boxes of, oh yeah, I love reading, and oh yeah, and I read to my kids, and you kind of check those boxes. But it's worth going back and really examining yourself. Do you deeply love learning and reading? If so, are you actively doing it? Are you, and don't just say, oh yep, I am. Are you actively, deeply in love with learning? Are you pursuing your own education? Be just totally honest with yourself. Because I meet people sometimes, I have those conversations, like, oh yeah. I'm like, well, tell me, like, let's look at this. Let's go in here and really examine. And then we realize in the deep examination, like, well, no, you're not. Actually, you're not an active learner, and you're not in love with learning. Maybe you did before, or you dabble here and there, but you're not actively in love with learning. So,
and most important, your children aren't seeing that process.
That's the other thing. So if you are in love with learning, do your kids know that? And it's not like, I love learning, you should read, or you should read because I love it. Like that's a turd in the punch bowl, right? It's not going to go over well. You have to become so tactful and influential. You have to be a great teacher. You have to be a great mentor. You have to share that love with them, not just by saying it. I love learning. You should too. Why don't you love learning? I love learning. Like that, all that, it doesn't help. It actually hurts. It drives them away. Your love of learning is going to be exuded by loving learning, and they see you reading, and then you're like, oh, you guys, oh my goodness, let me tell you, this is what happened. And you tell the story. You share the quote. You share what's happening in there. And like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Or no, like they'll see you reading, and then all of a sudden you just verbally, no, my gosh, don't, no. And they're like, what's going on? You're like, oh my gosh, okay, this guy's in here and he's about to make a bad decision. I am, oh man, I hope he does not do that. I got to keep reading to see if this happens, because he can't do that. And they're like, what? And you see what I'm doing? You're drawing them in. You're getting them into what you're feeling. But most of you sit there like you're dead. And look at you like I'd run over and check your pulse. And you're like, yeah, I love this book. And you're like, yeah, it looks like you're dead. So show it and share it in a way that draws them into it. And I did this so well that long before our kids were old enough to read or old enough to listen to audiobooks, I was sharing what I was reading. And they could not get enough of it. They were just dying. Specifically, we always talk about this when I read Les Mis. We were living in Costa Rica, and every day, they came to me begging, what did you read from Les Mis today, Dad? Tell us what's happening in your book. They just couldn't get enough of them. And that's a long, long book, and I drew it out over months. And so I told them all the stories. They all fell in love with that story. Now it's just in our family. It's part of our family culture, Les Mis. Because I told them all the stories. I drew them in. I became a great storyteller. That's how you convey love of learning and love of stories. And then they hunger and thirst for it. So you've got to be really, really good at loving it and then sharing the love.
It requires you to geek out about it a little bit. Like you have to be emotive about the process.
Because like you were saying, literally hear some of you say, I'm not very emotive.
Not like that.
Yeah, I'm not like that.
That's not me. Well, okay, guess what? Your choices have consequences, as Greg loves to say. And I get it, because I'm also not that super emotive person. That's definitely more of Greg's strength. But I have learned how to be more emotive in my own way. We're not saying you all have to be Greg Denning, neither do I. But you can, in your own way, share what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're learning. The more you share your internal process of what's going on with the process of loving learning, the more they're going to see, oh, this is actually a desirable thing, as opposed to it looks like this, boredom and pulselessness, you're dead, and yet you're telling me how wonderful it is. They don't know what's happening. Exactly. They don't know the internal process you're experiencing that makes it a worthwhile pursuit.
And you're sitting there saying, this is so wonderful, it's so exciting, it's so good. And they're looking at you and be like, you are boring. I don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah.
And that's just an honest truth. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be blunt. If they look at you and your outcomes and your result and your life, they subconsciously are going to be like, I don't want what you have. So I'm going to kind of discredit what you say. And this is a hard truth, but it's true.
Well, right. I mean, that is a hard truth because if, especially as kids get older, starting at 11, 12, 13, and into their teens, they do start looking around. And they're looking at their peers, and they're looking at the media, and they're looking at movies, and they're saying, you're telling me to read, but I'm looking around at all these other people, and they look like they're having a whole lot more fun. Why should I listen to you?
Or even getting better results. Like,
Right.
oh, that's so-and-so.
He doesn't read.
Yeah, and again, this is holistic. This wasn't the intention here, but this is super important. It is holistic. If they look at you and they're like, well, I just hear you fighting all the time and complaining all the time, and you're unhealthy, you're out of shape, you don't look like you're enjoying life.
Of course, they can't verbalize or
Yeah,
articulate.
they can't articulate any of this, and most of it's subconscious, and a lot of it is literally biological. You're biological. You're trying to figure out life, and you're like, just my overall assessment is you're not thriving. You're not doing so well in life. You're not living the life I want to live, and yet you keep telling me to read. So subconsciously, they're going to connect like, well, reading equals your outcomes. Like, I'm out. And so in a holistic approach, you have to be thriving. You have to be living what you're preaching here. And showing
vocalizing
them the benefits
Yeah.
of reading.
Yeah, showing and vocalizing, because often just showing is not enough either.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that as sort of the foundation, along with getting your kids to fall in love with stories, because that's the essence of reading. At least when you begin to fall in love with it, it's the stories. Really, you're falling in love with the stories.
Even in the
And
great
that's what
personal development books, there's tons of stories.
Absolutely.
And so we'll share, Rachel and I we share all the stories we can from personal development books we're reading.
Yeah. So it's kind of this mindset shift you need to make. Like, oh, no, what I'm trying to do is help my kids fall in love with stories. Because if they fall in love with stories, then they'll easily fall in love with reading. Now, there's another part of this that I want to emphasize or mention, because I feel that it's very important, especially in our day and age. Greg and I are both from the generation that was kind of the transition between no technology and technology. In our teenage years is when the internet came out and computers and, all the things started coming. Before that, if you wanted to learn things, you had books. That was it. Movies did start to come out, of course, and then there's the radio. But things have drastically shifted since then. All of us know this. Like, the world has drastically changed. So much so in the past 30 years, or less even, 20 to 30 years, that it's a totally different world. And so in some ways, we have to redefine what we mean by getting our kids to, quote unquote, love reading. Because ultimately, what we want is the outcome of that process, which used to be only achieved primarily through, or mainly achieved, through reading physical books.
Now, this is a great time to jump in here. I am still a huge advocate for paper books.
As am I.
And, electronic books are great. And when they came out, we're like, this is amazing. I can take hundreds of books and they weigh nothing. I can add 50 books to my phone and it doesn't change its weight. Like, we're going to travel with ebooks. And then we realized, out of sight, out of mind, we read less, the kids read less. It just wasn't there. There was no physical presence. Whatever it is, there is something literally connecting with holding a book in your hand and reading the pages.
Absolutely.
So we've paid many, many thousands of dollars to pack hundreds and hundreds of pounds of books all over the stinking planet. And I felt like a pack mule for years, and it was #worth it.
Yes.
So having them is still valuable. Yes, ebooks are great. They're a great advantage. Audiobooks are great. I still think all of us should have paper. So right here, we're sitting in our bedroom recording. Both of us have books sitting on our nightstands. There's books on Rachel's desk and shelves all around her desk. On my office, there's books everywhere. We have books out on our table in the family room. There's books all around. We have books wherever we go.
Yes, which is obviously a key part of this. But what I do want to say is that just because we love physical books and we encourage them, we've also shifted, and I would say shifted because, earlier on in our marriage and our parenting journey, we were more about the physical books. Like, that was the primary desired outcome, was for our children to read physical books most of the time. But I would say that shifted partly, one, because technology itself has changed, and two, because we've also realized that not every brain, not every child is the same. They all have different learning strengths and capabilities. Our oldest daughter has dyslexia.
Which forced us...
Some of our kids have ADD,
That
ADHD.
forced us in a hard way to reconsider our core flaw. We were just like, we will read paper books. And then our oldest daughter can't read, really. I mean, she's doing great now, but she couldn't.
Yeah,
and,
it was a major
struggle.
struggle.
My goodness, that was just the biggest slap in the face and gut punch for us. And we're like, oh, everything we dreamed of. And then that's where we forced us to make this massive shift to audiobooks.
Exactly.
Which she loves and listened to so many audiobooks.
Which, ironically, you and I had made that shift to audiobooks because books on tape is how they came out. We used to get books on tape from the library because we started to get into this mode of learning while you're driving, learning while you're exercising. We wanted to add more learning to our life, which we realized cannot happen with a physical book only mindset. Because if you want to add more learning and you only read physical books, well, you can only do that when you're sitting down with a book.
Exactly.
But if you add audiobooks, well, now you can learn in the car, and now you can learn while you're walking, and now you can learn while you're washing the dishes. So we had made that shift then, but then for our children, we still were like, oh, well, you've got to first read physical books. And then when our daughter had dyslexia, we're like, oh, okay, well, I guess we rethink this. And so we did the audiobooks. And yeah, she is a huge learner. She absolutely loves listening to all kinds of books. Her favorite book is Crime and Punishment. But it's all based on audible learning, basically. It's all listened content. So that's one of the things that we have to include in this, is when we're like, I want my children to love learning. Well, some of us have this definition of that means you sit down with a physical book and you're reading from a physical book. And that's not always going to be the case.
Some kids literally cannot stand sitting still.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
And so the barrier to entry is sitting still, where they would love learning if they can move.
Exactly, because we have another son who is an amazing child and, super responsible, but he's this very active learner. He just needs to be moving, hands-on. He absolutely loves audiobooks. But one of the reasons that he loves it is because he can do other things while he's still learning from a book. So he can listen to a book and he can build something, or he can, go outside, he can run, he can do other things. So when we allow that definition or that flexibility into their learning, well, we're encouraging their love of learning without having it to fit into these certain specified rules that we have that in some ways are outdated, because things have changed. And
I'm still, though, an advocate. Like,
I know.
For me, at least for the foreseeable future, sitting down with a nice book in your hand, I just am going to keep advocating that.
Well, absolutely.
So
but I think it's important to point out that even though you still love that, you average a book a week, but I would say primarily
Audible.
It's through Audible books.
Yep, absolutely.
Primarily, the content you're consuming, like you read physical books every night, so do I. But most of your content consumption is still done through audiobooks because you can do it while you're driving, while you're exercising, while you're doing these other things.
As you practice, it's actually a skill you have to develop, how to listen to books. You think, oh, I can do it. No, your mind wanders. It's all over the place. When I first started listening, I'm like, what? What? I was thinking about this, and like 2 chapters passed. I don't even know what happened.
Yeah.
You have to practice listening, and then you get better at it. It's just with every skill. You get better at it, and then you can multitask. Like you can work on something. Now, again, it can't be very thoughtful. If you have to do something very thoughtful, if I'm trying to measure and work on something and build something, then something. I'm either listening to a book and I make a bad cut, or I'm making a cut and didn't listen to the book. So it has to be kind of thoughtless, like walking, exercising, washing dishes. But you get better at it, and then you can increase the speed. So you can go to 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 2, and I'm at 2.2 now. Is where I listen to my books. And if you were to do that right now, you'd be like, this is incomprehensible. I can't even understand this person. This is crazy. You have to work up to it. And you do not lose comprehension or retention. It's amazing. The mind is even more active and more alert and captures more. It's incredible.
Well, what's really fascinating, I've found that our children, and they don't necessarily do this with every book, but on books they've listened to more than once, because they do that. They get these series they love, and then they'll listen to them, once a year or something. They can actually listen to them at 3x
which is insane to me.
speed.
I'm not even there.
Which I'm like, can you even understand that?
Right.
And yet they've trained their brains to be able to, and granted it's content they're familiar with, but...
And it's just stories.
Yeah, and it's just stories. But, that's something
It's
they do.
incredible.
So they consume huge amounts of content, but that's one way they do it.
And
now,
think how that diminishes a barrier to entry. Where you pick up a book, it's my experience, a 1,200-page book. You're like, oh man, that's all these words I have to try to pronounce. I can't. The vocabulary's over my head. It's so much, and I have to sound out each word. And they can listen to it at double speed, and they have somebody read to them with all their fun voices, and especially when they're characters and it's dramatized. Like that just eliminates this barrier to entry.
Which there was a part of me that used to think that was a problem. I'm like, well, I don't want my kids to be entertained. I want them to be able to do the hard work of reading a book. And while, okay, I get that has value, ultimately, if our desired outcome is for our kids to love learning, well then, why are we trying to make it harder than it needs to be?
Learning, especially early on, and the vast majority of the time, learning should be entertaining. When you're really learning, when you're in the zone of learning, it's entertaining.
Right.
There is a time and place for really hard learning. You should all read the essay by Mortimer Adler, it's called An Invitation to the Pain of Learning. It's phenomenal.
But if
there's a time and place for that, but it's usually later teens, early 20s.
Yeah, if we lead out with that, then we're basically... We're trying to get them to do something that seems hard and miserable. And they're like, why?
Yeah.
Why would I do that? Well, because you need to learn grit and hard. Yeah, I get that. We're going to learn that. But the best way to draw something in, to fall in love with something, is not to lead with the most painful aspect of it.
Because you want them to actually want and enjoy the painful part later. Because you can force your kids to do it. You're like, we do hard things around our kids. Just get gritty. Stop using your 6-year-old age as an excuse, right? And we're missing the mark, where if we do it right with tact and love and they're in it, then later on they'll joyfully choose the pain of learning and the pain of doing hard things. And you're out there doing something that's so excruciating that most people avoid, even most adults, and your kids will be like, this is so hard, but I love it.
I think a good example of this was, so our oldest son is 19 right now, and we've spent the past 6 months traveling. He traveled with us for 3 of those before he moved out. And while we were traveling, he chose to listen to a whole bunch of books. I don't remember how many.
And he did ebooks too. He literally read
books,
in fact, in that section, he read more than he listened to.
Okay.
It was incredible.
I think it was about 30 or 40 books. But
in a 3-month period,
in a 3-month period while we were traveling. And so
just pause right there for a second. Have you ever read, like, how long is it taking you taken you, listener, to read 30 books? Like, let that sink in. 30 good books, not fluff, not garbage, like 30 really good books. I'm guessing most of you would be like, whew, that was the last 3 years or 5 years. And to get that much, and some of you haven't ever read 30 really great books, but to get that much in a 3-month period.
Plus all of the amount of I mean, we went to 13 countries while he was doing it. But the point is, like, we led out with everything we've already discussed here for his whole entire life, basically. And so he chose to do this on his own. He had been reading before. You know, it's not like he wasn't reading. He had been reading, but not at that level of intensity. But he also chose to take on hard books. Like, I think one of the ones he read was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is a challenging book, you know. Point being, he chose to do the hard work of reading those levels of books because he wanted to. It was something he chose.
Yeah, that was on his own. I didn't even say anything. It was not. He just like, you know what, I'm on it, and he just hit it. Actually, you guys, I did a podcast episode with him on the Be the Man podcast.
Yeah.
We did the whole interview, talked through the whole thing. It is worth listening to. It's really powerful.
So, but it came from leading out with the stories and getting them to fall in love with that process, along with modeling it for them and sharing our own journey of learning and growth and excitement about learning, but also embracing this other way of learning that doesn't have to look just like it used to look, or just like we think it should look with this physical book sitting down. I just want to throw this in because another way that we do this, that we encourage this, that we facilitate this is right now, I think with our 12-year-old son, it's a perfect example. And we've done this with pretty much all of the kids, I think. But we have this framework where, you know, they do their morning routine and then they have study time. And when they finish study time, then they are allowed to listen to their audiobooks of choice, the ones they want to listen to. But it's not just unlimited listening, right? It's not just like, oh, now you get to sit on the couch and listen to audiobooks for hours, right?
Although that happens sometimes.
Sometimes, it does. But the agreement that I have with my son right now is as long as he's active, doing chores or working on stuff, he has a time limit password, so I give him an hour at a time. So I give him 1 hour and he goes and does something and then he comes back and I'm like, okay, what are you going to do next? And he goes and works on that thing for another hour. And so he's being active and productive, but also just loving listening to his audiobook.
This is such a good example. He is so in love with stories that he'll come to Rachel and say, hey, I'm going to do all the dishes. Can I listen to my book?
Yeah.
He'll come do chores, like chores that people don't want to. He's like, I'm going to go sweep up. I'm going to go clean up. I'm going to go do this thing. And he's willingly doing a chore that needs to be done because he loves reading that much. So not reading, listening. He loves stories that much. That's a great point. These other barriers, like other seemingly unrelated barriers, are gladly overcome.
Exactly.
Because of how much he loves story.
Right. And so it's this powerful process of encouraging that love of story. Plus I do include in that, you know, I will buy him a new audiobook, you know, another credit on Audible. It's part of his payment for doing his work.
All of our kids are constantly asking for more books.
Yeah, he's motivated by that.
We have 700 books in Audible.
Our family library.
And they're 11 or 12 bucks each. So do the math. We're up $8,000 just in audiobooks. Worth it, man. There's so much goodness in there. I want to back up a little bit and kind of deep dive again. Are you reading to your children? Literally, truly, are you reading to your children? And I hope if it's a no, that needs to change. You've got to be reading to your kids. And read books that they will like. Read books that they will love. Now, it doesn't mean you have to sacrifice standards and read crap and fluff and garbage. Find really great books that they love. Read from the classics, but don't pick classics that they'll get into, that they'll love. I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to my kids, all of them. And basically the routine was every night I would read to the kids. And it wasn't always, and there was time periods when life was crazy when I didn't do it. I'm doing it now again. Right now I'm reading Around the World in 80 Days and to my little girls. And it was so cute. Sage, who's 9, she said to me last night when we were reading, she's like, Dad, there's lots of big words. I don't understand all the words. And I'm like, but do you understand the story? And she's like, yeah, I think so. And I'm like, share me the story. She's like, this is happening. I'm like, it's great. And so I'm quick to point out, share the lessons. Oh, what do we learn from that? Oh, look at that. That's cool. That's cool. And a lot of it is, it's such a beautiful way to introduce your children to vocabulary. And there's a lot of vocabulary in that book. And these little classics. But you're introducing them with vocabulary and ideas and concepts and things, especially that one. He dives into all these details about India and Africa and all this stuff and history and all these religions and all this different stuff. And he's covering it all. And it's just a simple introduction. I don't expect my little kids to understand it or grasp it. But what it's doing is just building this little scaffolding that later on we'll circle back to it. And they've heard that. And it's all these touch points, right? And introducing it again and again and again until finally it sticks. And they have this massive exposure. So read to your children. And then in devotionals, Rachel reads from Story of the World. And so we're reading, actively reading to our kids and sharing what we're learning.
Well, I want to add that that's actually another benefit of audiobooks is because generally people tend to listen or have read to them, in the case of you reading to your kids or them listening to an audiobook, they listen at a level that's above their current reading level.
Exactly. Yep.
Which is actually a positive thing because it's helping them with vocabulary and all of these other things that isn't necessarily happening. Because there's
so true.
When you're talking about reading, there's actually multiple layers there. One of them is the actual physical process of what's going on in your brain while you're trying to decipher signs on a page and translate that into a word that you can say. So that's not actually comprehension, The comprehension happens more when you can just listen to, you're not doing the physical part of it, you're just listening to it and you're hearing the story and you're comprehending it and you're retaining it.
Yeah. Especially when you're learning.
That's a different thing.
Yeah, especially when you're learning, sometimes the actual reading of it interrupts the comprehension because it's so much work to say the word, identify the word, and put the words together in a string. Like there's so much effort going into just reading it that you're not putting that much effort into comprehending it. So that's a great point.
And so in some ways, if you want your kids to fall in love with the story so they fall in love with books, the more content they can get in that they actually comprehend and fall in love with, well, that's actually better, which eventually will drive them to improve their learning skill, the reading skill itself, so that they can have access to more content.
And they'll make them better readers when they turn back to it because they have more vocabulary.
Yeah, they're familiar with more of the vocabulary.
More concepts. Really powerful.
I thought maybe just for fun we'd read some of the books we have in our Audible library as a reference because people are constantly asking. In fact, one of the other comments I got was, what are some books you recommend for Well,
we have a recommended reading list, and in my list specifically, there's a whole section for youth. And I think you adults should read all the books that are in the youth section. It's not just for youth, it's for you too. But I think it's great for youth. So in there, depending on maturity and reading level stuff, maybe 11 or 12 up, and that's that youth section in my list. It's great. But even for little ones, get one of our favorites was the Illustrated Classics.
Yes.
What was it? That was
There's
a
an
little white
entire
set.
It's white, hardback. It's called The Great Illustrated Classics, and it's basically all of the classics, but in condensed form.
Super abridged.
Illustrated with simple illustrations.
Loved it.
They love those books. Usborne has a great collection of abridged stories. They've got lots of Dickens and all kinds of other abridged stories.
But I read every book from Wizard of Oz, all 15 of them. I read all of the Narnia stuff. I read all the Betsy Tacy series. I read all of the Little Britches series, all Little House on the Prairie. I mean, take these series like that that teach great principles and lesson great stories. I read all those books to the kids.
Now, that being said, I think especially the tween age, starting 11, 12, on into their teenage years, that's when kids can start to learn this, start to lose this love of learning And so it can be really important to get them engaged with books that they're still interested in. So I am going to read some that are currently on our list. Now, I will tell you, I haven't vetted these because I've gotten to the point where I allow my teenagers to pick the books, and they're pretty good at picking, and I'll ask them, I'm like, what's in this book? What's the content? Is it appropriate for our 12-year-old, et cetera, et cetera?
And sometimes they'll notice, like, Kimball said this, and he's like, I got into this one, I listened to the first one, and he's like, there wasn't a whole lot of substance to it. It was kind of lame. So he's like, yeah, don't do that one.
So they are pretty good about doing that.
But no, I don't know if we should. It's even worth or valuable
some.
to share that. But like they got into the Percy Jackson series,
of course,
Brandon Sanderson series. There's a lot there, but don't discount the classics either. I know those are kind of the modern ones are more of kind of they're more exciting, more exhilarating, more snarky and sassy. There's some substance. But don't discount the classics, the great classics, the great stories. And again, you have to get a story one, and you have to get, and I'll read those ones. You know, the Seawolf by Jack London. The vocabulary is challenging. The writing in the old English or the accents, it was extremely challenging. Our kids couldn't comprehend it. So I read it, and I read in the voices, and I did the voice, I did that. They all loved that book, but they could not read it on their own.
Nor could they have listened to it on their own because they didn't have you there to kind of translate it for them. So books like that. So I know what you're saying, like, you know, we don't want to discount the classics, but it can be challenging because it's spoken in a language that's not what we speak today.
Right.
So it needs some sort of translation. I would say even the same with some of Louis L'Amour's stuff, because our kids have loved that, but there was a time when they had a hard time understanding it.
Western.
And so you kind of had to translate it for them. Right. So especially at first, that's helpful, because I know, like our 18-year-old son now, he loves Louis L'Amour. But when he first started listening to it, he had a hard time understanding what they were saying.
What are they even saying? And
so when you listened with him, and you would listen to the audiobooks like while you were driving on a road trip or something, and you could help him understand the story and what's happening and what they said, then that helped him to be able to now he can understand them himself, and he can listen to them on his own.
That's a good example. I took two of our boys, and we drove from Georgia to Guatemala, and on that trip I think we listened to 5 Louis L'Amour books. And man, they just loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. And I did too. I absolutely loved it. Like, we'd stop for gas, and they're like, quick, get back in so we can start the book. Or we'd stop for food or whatever, any break, and they're like, let's throw the book back on. And it was incredible for both of them to do that. And our then 11-year-old was just all over it. It was fantastic. So
yeah. So in that case, that's done as a co-activity, and that's helpful for those books they can understand. Now, on their own.
You know what? I forgot about. We did a ton of that. We listened to a lot of books while we were driving together as a family.
Yeah, back in our Alaska to Panama
days. Then, and we do tons of road trips. We've driven across the country multiple times. We spent a lot of time doing road trips, and we'll listen to books together. And I forgot about that. We would listen and discuss a lot of books together as a family.
Although that also doesn't always work, and notice as a lot of the kids have gotten older, it doesn't work as much because we're all at different levels, we all have different interests, and so the younger kids are like, I don't understand this book, turn it off. So you have to kind of adjust to the situation and circumstance. But what I'm trying to say is, while all of that is valuable, and I agree with all of that, and we may have differing opinions on this, I think that when they're listening to things on their own, it may be more of what we call fluffy sometimes. But it can still be valuable because they're falling in love with the process of learning. So, the process of listening and stories. And
I understand that. In fact, my own story too.
My
own story. I was reading things as a kid that got me the love of learning and love of books that I wouldn't read today.
Right.
And I wouldn't
Absolutely.
share. I'm like, there's not a lot of substance there. And I on a principle level, like, there's so many phenomenal classics. There's so many great books, more than you'll ever read in a lifetime. There's no reason to go through the fluff. There's no reason to consume fluff because there's too many good books that have substance.
Right. But
that being said,
That's for a more mature level,
Yeah.
I would say, because while you're still trying to get your kids to fall in love with learning, like, here's an example. We were traveling through Turkey. We didn't have very many physical books, and we had nothing available for our 12-year-old, and I wanted him to read a physical book just because I wanted him to practice his reading. And we were at a bookstore, and I found Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Now, that's not a book I would normally buy. That's just not one of my personal favorites, but I got it. I'm like, okay, he's going to read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. No big deal. He's going to practice his reading. It's something I think he would be interested in. And we got it, and he read it, and he didn't even like it enough for me to buy the next one, but the point was he read it, and he practiced his reading. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. We do kind of maybe, if we want to say, quote unquote, sacrifice their standards a little bit on some of the things we're going to let them read or listen to while they go through this transitional phase. Yes, we want them to read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. But if we expect them to read that when they're 12, we're not going to develop this love of learning. So my 12-year-old is listening to things like He Who Fights with Monsters or Percy Jackson or, whatever else is on the list. That's kind of where we need to have this little flexibility, if that makes sense.
So my position is I don't like that, but
and that's why I was saying
we've come to an agreement.
We
here
may
that
disagree a little bit on
Rachel
that, although
does that.
you do recognize that was kind of part of your own journey,
Yep.
as well as part of my journey.
Yep.
Mark of the Thief is something they've listened to. But then the other thing is too, like with our now teenagers, we are as a family, older family members, are going through books together that we're discussing.
Yeah,
we have a list. So
really
we've done
great list of the classics.
obviously Jane Austen, The Scarlet Letter. We've done. I'm currently working on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and
Moby Dick.
I did Moby Dick before that, and all of you have already done those. I'm kind of behind all of you guys. You're ahead of me.
Yeah, Red Badge of Courage is on that list.
Return of the Native. So we have an entire list like that, which I actually should share, that we are working on. Oliver Twist was one of them. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, of course. And then, here's another thing too. Like a great way to connect learning to real life is to connect it to things you're doing. Now, obviously, the travel is a good example because, like, when we went to Warsaw and Auschwitz in Poland, we, as a family, listened to
That was so good.
books about it. So we listened to Auschwitz Lullaby and The Teacher of Warsaw, which were amazing.
The Teacher of Warsaw was so powerful.
Yeah. I had my 12-year-old, we were going to Krakow, I had him listen to The Trumpeter of Krakow. So you connect it to things. So if there's Civil War sites around you or something like that, connect the learning. But try to find something that's, a story. You don't want to make them listen to some historical book that's dry and boring. You want to connect it with a story that's interesting to them. Gulliver's Travels. There's a lot in here. But
700.
There's 700 in here. Return of the Dragon Slayers by Brandon Mole. That's one of them that my kids
Oh, yeah,
listen
they
to.
really like Brandon Mole and Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah.
I like Brandon Sanderson's book. I think there's more substance in there. Some of them are very good.
Right. So, anyways, that's... my son listened to one about Vikings. I don't know if I should recommend it because Viking stuff is pretty violent, but, we went to Norway, and so we learned about the Vikings. So, again, just some other ideas. So, I think that's enough. That's enough of an idea, a framework, an outline. Just facilitate the love of stories. The more you can do that, the more you can get your kids to fall in love with story, which I am going to say includes movies. Like, movies are stories. And so if they can fall in love with story, and then you can connect that, I think that's where audiobooks are powerful because anyone can listen to an audiobook.
One way we navigated that is we knew there was a good movie, and so we would read the book. Or listen to it. It's like, hey, everybody listen to this book. When we're done listening, we'll watch it.
Exactly.
That was a great transition. And what was super cool about that is they all noticed the book was better than the movie.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you want to have happen. You don't want them saying, I don't want to read the book. I'll just watch the movie. Because it's such passive learning for the most part for movies. And it's like, it's a little effort. But if they listen or read the book first and then watch the movie, like, oh, the movie's kind of disappointing because the book is so good. That's
'Cause there's so much
exactly what you want going
content.
on. They're like, oh, I prefer the book.
And another thing I will do, because they do love story, that if, say, they, especially with my younger children, if they want to watch a movie, and, for us, we try to stick to once a week on that, I'll be like, no, we're not watching a movie tonight, but you can listen to an audiobook, Let's get an audiobook that you can listen to, especially when it's not something that they can do just all the time, because that is a part of it. It's not just available 24/7. So you make that a part of something that they're allowed to do, and it becomes a fun thing, that's entertaining and beneficial.
Help them want it. Help them love it. Help them enjoy it. Help them see all of it. And as you're constantly reading and sharing what you're reading, and it's helping you be a better person, helping you get better results, and you're sharing how exciting it is, how real it is, how relevant it is. You're making connections to real life so that they get this sense of like, man, these great old books are super relevant to real life scenarios. They'll help me be happier and more successful. Of course I want books in my life. Mm-hmm. And then you oh man, it's beautiful. And then you get into biographies and autobiographies and history. Oh, I love reading.
That has happened, with our older teens. We've just seen that naturally happen, where they start getting older and they get more interested in other content. Our oldest daughter especially, she loves biographies. And, Marcus Aurelius, of course, we mentioned, and other Stoic literature, and, on and on. Our son right now, he's out doing sales and he's listening to sales books. And they just naturally make that connection, like you said, where they begin saying, oh, yeah, books. This is where we get story and information and learning and education and guidance and mentoring. And they just turn to those things. And then that carries over into podcasts and other. You just become a consumer of content, which is ultimately, back to the original question, like, what is it we really want? That's what we really want. We want our children to consume content that has a positive effect on their lives.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And it has certainly had a positive effect on our lives.
Absolutely.
I can wholeheartedly, without reservation, say that reading has totally transformed my life. And that essentially, if you could trace it back upstream, every good thing we have in our life, this extraordinary family life we live, this dream life we're living, is because of books. Mm-hmm. Book after book after book led us down the path to become better people, more capable, more knowledgeable, understanding human beings, and it's blessed every aspect of our life. And then we get to share it, right? Rachel gets to share it in the 28 Challenge. I get to share it in the master class. All of this comes from just the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books across time and space that have helped us understand life and given us tools. We get to sit at the feet, so to speak, of some of the greatest thinkers and leaders of all times. Or conversely, sometimes some of the worst thinkers and leaders of all time. You're like, yeah, and it's worth reading. And you get to read tragedies. And that's important at a certain age. You read the tragedies.
Right.
This series that the classics that we're reading with our older teens, a lot of them end. There's no happily ever after endings. It's tragic endings. And they're like, oh, this is getting depressing. Book after book, sad ending. I'm like, that's the reality check. That so many lives, real lives, actual lives, end tragically because choices have consequences. And it is so important to read both sides. That, oh, look, these good choices led to this wonderful outcome. And it's just as important to read these books that say, man, these poor choices led to terrible outcomes.
Yeah, Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary are both on the list.
Yes, and you gotta read those. Well, and even the Return of the Native. No! It's so sad. I get into the stories so much and love them and learn from them. So this is great. Continue your education. Help your kids facilitate theirs. This deep love of learning. And it'll be such a blessing for our families. Love you guys. Thanks for listening. Reach out.